Welcome to our presentation this week of Yes, Juvenile Life Sentences Without Parole Are Cruel and Unusual Punishment. This presentation is by Melissa Cowley, Diana Constanza, Sydney Howig, Lainey Jensen, Kiara Larson, and BJ Vickers. Introduction. The United States is the only country in the world that allows juvenile life sentence without parole. We are the only ones who are sentencing children to spend the rest of their lives in prison without a chance to reintegrate into society later, even though it is recognized globally that children cannot be held to the same level of responsibility as adults. Approximately 1,465 children were serving life sentences in 2020. Although this is a high number, it has gone down about 38% since 2016. This number continues to go down thanks to the movement to protect youth rights. 27 states and the District of Columbia have banned life sentences without parole. Additionally, there are about 9 other states where no person under 18 is serving a life sentence. To emphasize, children are constitutionally different than adults in their levels of culpability. For this reason, there are several cases in which the Supreme Court has ruled against life sentences. Because of the difference in maturity, and to protect the Eighth Amendment that limits cruel and unusual punishment, which would be if a child is sentenced to die in prison. We will dive more into some of the high-profile cases that back up our stance on how juvenile life sentences without parole are in fact cruel and unusual. In our first example of why juvenile life sentences without parole are cruel, we have the Supreme Court case of Roper v. Simmons. For background, Christopher Simmons was 17 when he committed capital murder. When he was 18, he was sentenced to death. The Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty for individuals convicted of crimes before they were 18 was unconstitutional. This ruling was backed by extensive research that demonstrated that juveniles possess greater capacity for rehabilitation. Juveniles are more susceptible to negative peer pressure. They are immature and impaired in their judgment and decision making. This case was a huge stepping stone in showing that juvenile offenders are fundamentally different from adults and need to be sentenced as such. The next case is Graham versus Florida. Graham was 16 when he committed armed burglary. He was sentenced to life in prison for a burglary charge. The Supreme Court found that it was cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a juvenile to life in prison without parole for a non-homicide crime. This ruling passed on the grounds that while juveniles should not be absolved of responsibility, that is, they still need to face consequences for their actions, but the limited culpability of juvenile offenders needs to be a determining factor in sentencing. Life without parole denies juvenile offenders the chance to grow and mature. This case further shows that juvenile offenders are not the same as adults. Treating them the same can lead to cruel and unusual punishment. Our final example case, and the most important, is Miller versus Alabama. Miller was just 14 when he and a friend lit a trailer on fire, killing a man inside. Miller was sentenced to life without parole in adult criminal court. The Supreme Court ruled that no juvenile defendant may face a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, no matter how serious the crime. The Supreme Court, building off of the past cases we discussed, found that juvenile life sentences without parole are cruel and unusual punishment. Judges and juries may have the opportunity to consider the circumstances before imposing such a harsh penalty. Miller was only 14 and was too young to understand the seriousness of his actions. What he did was wrong, but a life sentence without parole was not an appropriate punishment considering his age and circumstances. Are juveniles really different than adults? The simple answer is yes. They are quite a bit different. Let's talk about some of the reasons they are different and why those differences make it cruel and unusual punishment to give them a life sentence. First is brain development. The human brain doesn't finish developing until your mid to late 20s. The part of the brain that is one of the last parts to mature is the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain controls a human's ability to delay and reflect, meaning the lack of development limits the amount of time juveniles will think before they act. Take all options into account. Juveniles are extremely impulsive and do not think things all the way through. Contemplate risk and consequences. Sensation seeking is at an all-time high at mid-adolescence. Have social intelligence. Juveniles have difficulty being empathetic and are susceptible to peer pressure. 2. Opportunity for rehabilitation. Giving someone a life sentence ensures that they never get the opportunity to rehabilitate, mature, and become a productive member of society. And 3rd, the sheer number of years. Obviously, the younger you are, the longer your life sentence will typically end up being, making it unfair for juveniles. In this slide, it talks about how the prefrontal cortex engages with the rest of your brain. Present in the front of the frontal lobe, behind the forehead, and makes up about 10% of the volume of your brain. The prefrontal cortex regulates behavior, personality, executive functions, and planning. It works in tandem with the amygdala and the hypothalamus for behavioral regulation. And it coordinates with the hippocampus and thalamus for decision-making, problem-solving, and navigating information. The prefrontal cortex is divided into 2 parts. The medial PFC controls introspection, memory, and emotional processing. The lateral PFC controls how sensation and movement are processed. Damage to the prefrontal cortex can result in personality changes and impaired emotional responses. What was the worst thing you did as a child? Should your whole life be based on your worst decision? It is not only common sense that children are not fully developed mentally or physically in comparison to adults, but it has also been medically studied and scientifically confirmed. Children are less mature, which diminishes their culpability, making it cruel and unusual punishment to sentence them to a life in prison, ultimately breaking their constitutional rights. Knowing they will never have the opportunity to mature, rehabilitate, and then be given a chance to be a productive member of society still is not okay. If anyone is capable of being rehabilitated, it is a child. And not allowing them that opportunity is basically saying that no one can be rehabilitated, and it is not even worth trying. If that is the case, why do we have sentences at all? If rehabilitation is not possible, even for our youth, shouldn't we just commit everyone to a life in prison, regardless of the crime they commit? The answer is no, because rehabilitation is possible, and we need to help these kids rehabilitate instead of locking them up and throwing away the key. As a counter-argument, many might believe juvenile life sentencing to give a sense of justice to victims and families. The loss of a loved one to violent crime leaves families in unimaginable pain. For many, closure is found in knowing that the individual responsible will face the consequences of their actions through a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This form of sentencing ensures justice is served and provides families with a sense of finality. When juvenile offenders commit such heinous acts, their actions often result in lifelong suffering for the victims' families. A life sentence reflects the enduring impact of the crime, ensuring that the punishment aligns with the gravity of their offense. For families, this assurance can help them begin to cope with their immense trauma and move toward emotional healing. Victims' families often endure immense emotional trauma after losing a loved one to a crime. A life sentence without parole can provide a crucial sense of closure, assuring them that the person responsible will never re-enter society. This assurance can serve as a form of justice, offering some solace in knowing that the legal system recognizes the severity of their loss. Juvenile offenders, despite their age, can inflict long-lasting suffering on victims' families. A life sentence reflects the gravity of their actions and acknowledges the enduring pain caused. For many families, this form of justice is essential to their ability to begin processing their grief and finding a path forward after such devastating experiences. In conclusion, there are many examples of cases that do deserve the highest degree of punishment, and there are plenty of cases that show the exact opposite. Here are some examples as to why it wouldn't be the best idea. Increased risk of recidivism. This is all that they know. When they get thrown back into society, crime and prison is their only safe space. They will more than likely reoffend. There is no deterrence. This will not deter other juveniles from committing crimes. There is no lesson in prison sentences. In a aforementioned trial, in this presentation, Roper versus Simmons, the court stated, juvenile offenders cannot be Juvenile offenders cannot with reliability be classified as the worst offenders because they are less mature and their sense of responsibility has not fully developed. Science has proven that our frontal lobe isn't even formed until our early to late 20s. Our frontal lobe is in charge of our decision-making, planning, problem-solving, and controls our emotions. As a teenager or a juvenile, you aren't even close to emotionally maturity. Taking them away from society at a crucial time of development will only hurt them when they are inevitably released back into society. Thank you for watching our presentation.